So today we are going to rock and roll through chapters 7 and 9. I think this will be the last time that you have to read 2 chapters together. So probation, intermediary sanctions is what your book calls it. I like intermediate sanctions better, but whatever. And parole. And the reason I'm only spending a short period of time on this is because if you're going into corrections, you will be taking the probation and parole class, which is an entire semester. So I'm just going to crunch a whole semester down into about an hour. And then we'll move on from there. And then Mr. Gilman's going to come in later. So are we ready? Yeah, all right. So probation versus parole. So let's make this easy. This is actually the way a probation parole officer explained it to me, because there is a difference. Now, a lot of people lump them together as the same thing. There's a difference. So probation is before prison. Short and sweet. So when we put you on probation, you have not gone to prison. We're putting you on probation instead of prison. Okay, does that make sense? Parole is after prison. You have already been to prison, and you are being released early for good behavior. So probation and parole, different things. Don't use them interchangeably because they are not the same thing. There's a lot of overlap. We'll talk about that, but they're different things. Probation before prison, parole after prison. So let's start with a formal definition now. I gave you the short abbreviated form to help you keep them straight in your head. Probation is a sentence without confinement. A sentence without confinement with special conditions and supervision in the community. It may be used with confinement, and it often is. A lot of times a person will be sentenced to a short period of time in jail and they come out and they're put on probation. So a lot of people think, well, no, wait a minute, probation always has jail. No, it doesn't. No, in fact, most of the time it doesn't have jail. But a lot of times judges will do that too. It is administered at the federal, the state, and the local level. And there are variations in how those things are done. At the federal level, they do their own thing. Right? At the state level, which is the circuit court level, at the Michigan Department of Corrections, they do their own thing. And at the district court level, that's your local level, and they kind of do their own thing. But it's essentially the same beast. They just administer things a little bit differently. Let's meet John Augustus, the father of probation. I've always said, if I could get a time machine, someday somebody's going to invent one, and I'm going to go back in time, and I'm going to have lunch with a lot of really interesting and wonderful people who have passed on. And this is one of the guys on my list. He's on my time machine list. I'm going to go back and have lunch with John Augustus because what he did was amazing. He's considered to be the father of probation, and he was what? What was his occupation? What's that? No, he wasn't a Quaker. Good guess. Not a Quaker. It was after that. Well, actually, no, the Quakers are still around. What did John Augustus do? Oh. I'm getting the idea that people may not have read the material. Occupation. Josh, help me out. What do you do for a living?
I know it.
I looked it over and I can't remember what he did either. Cobbler. That's right.
Cobbler, yes, he was a shoemaker. He was a shoemaker in what town? Starts with B. Boston. All right, he was a Boston shoemaker. So here's what he did, because there wasn't Netflix or Amazon Prime or video games or any of that. So for amusement, he would go to the courts and he would watch the courts. If you've been to court yourself and watched the courts, you know that it's a show. And what he saw over and over again that made him very sad was there were a lot of people who were relatively minor offenders that were being sent to jail because there simply wasn't anything else to do with them. And the judge can't just say, oh, well, it's a minor offense, so okay, no punishment for you. Because, you know, that kind of gives the go-ahead for everybody else to do that thing, and that's not cool. We can't do that. So the judge would put him in jail. Well, one day, John Augustus stands up in court, and the judge, of course, knew him well. And he says, Your Honor, I would like to post bail for this man. So this man was, you know, a frequent flyer, an alcoholic, a drunk. And he posted the bail for the man and took him under his wing, right? Gave him a job in a shoe shop because he was actually a business owner. He had a shoe shop. And a couple weeks later, he had to come back for court. And the judge was so impressed with what he saw, the change in the man. The man was cleaned up. He had a good set of clothes on. He wasn't drinking anymore. He was so impressed with the changes that he saw in the man when he returned to court, he released him. And John Augustus continued to do this, and it became kind of a thing for the Boston courts. Over 18 years, over the course of 18 years, he bailed out approximately 1,946 offenders with a forfeit of only 10. Males and females from all walks of life. His wife was in on it too. She was a cool lady too. Yeah, we've actually got a book on John Augustus down in our library if you want to check it out. It's kind of worth reading. But he died in 1859, and this would have died with him, except that it had become such a thing in Boston. He also created the term probation, which means what?
Proving yourself?
Yes, a period of proving oneself. From the Latin word probatio, a period of proving oneself. And he created the conditions of probation, revocation, and the pre-sentence investigation. Are you impressed yet? Because I am. I mean, he totally invented probation. They pulled it out of the air and invented it. You see why I want to have lunch with him? That's pretty cool. The first official office of probation came to be in Massachusetts in 1859, following the demise of John Augustus. So, as I said, when he died, it didn't die with him. The idea stayed. And Massachusetts said, this is such a cool thing, let's keep it. We want to make this official now. So they created the Office of Probation. And if you look at the ripple effect, remember from the jails video how Morgan Spurlock talks about the ripple effect of programs in jails? And even if only 1 or 2% of the people get help, how do those 1 or 2% of the population, of our jail population, ripple out with all of the people that they affect, you know, between their families, their friends, other possible crime victims that didn't become victimized because they got the help they needed, right? And look at the ripples on this. I mean, this is freaking huge, the ripples here. Because if you look from whenever John Augustus started this, what, 18 years before 1859, don't make me do math. But 1859, 49, 41, right? 1841? Okay, so from 1841 to now, nationwide, how many people do you think have been on federal, state, and local probation? Millions. Literally millions and millions of people. People that otherwise would have been put in jail or prison, which we know really does no good for anybody. Millions and millions of people who have been helped because probation is a sentence of hope. It says, we're not going to throw you away. We think that you can reform. So let us give you the tools that you need in the community to reform yourself. Millions and millions of people. And how many people do you think that they affect? You see how big this is? Yeah, now do you see why I want to meet this guy? Because the ripples are just incredible. I mean, you can't even get your head around it. The numbers are so big. Now let's look at parole. Probation is before prison. Parole is after prison. So here, a conditional early release of inmates by a parole board prior to the expiration of their sentence. So in other words, they're getting out of prison early because they behaved well. From the French word parole, which means what? Word of honor. All right, we're getting it now. I'm feeling better. I was feeling kind of bad at the beginning of the class here, but I'm feeling better now. Okay. Word of honor. Yes, indeed. And it actually has military roots because when prisoners of war were captured and they would be repatriated in a prisoner exchange, they were given a parole. In other words, they were asked to pledge their word of honor that they would not fight against the other side anymore. So they would be repatriated by their word of honor. So that idea carried over to corrections. Now, on parole, our hero here is Alexander McAnochy, who was a Scotsman who had a special interest in conditions of confinement because he himself had been held as a prisoner of war against the French. Right? It seems like the British are always fighting the French. When they weren't fighting the French, they were fighting the Americans. So he was taken as a prisoner of war, and he was kept in some pretty horrible conditions. So it, of course, engendered an interest in conditions of confinement. Now, old Alex here, he believed in a philosophy of self-discipline and motivation to change behavior. He believed that prisoners should be given the proper motivation to change their behavior, and it didn't include abuse. Quite the contrary. So he was named warden of the Norfolk Island Penal Colony from about 1840 to about 1844. It wasn't very long, because this was a very radical experiment that they let him run. So let's look at where Norfolk Island Penal Colony is. It's 1,000 miles from Australia. If you remember from our history discussion how we were shipping out prisoners to the colonies, and Australia was a big one. So here's Australia. You see Norfolk Penal Colony. There's not a map over here, but it's like 1,000 miles out. Now this was like their supermax, because Norfolk was for the baddest of the bad, the worst of the worst. It held the twice convicted convicts. So first they were convicted and shipped to the colonies as their punishment. And then they committed another crime while they were incarcerated. So maybe they assaulted somebody, maybe they escaped, maybe they even killed somebody. So they would put the worst of the worst out here 1,000 miles away from nowhere.
Straight in the water.
Right, you aren't going anywhere, are you? So that's what it looks like now. Apparently it's a resort for Australians.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, but here's some of the old footings and foundations of the penal colony there. It's kind of neat.
It's like if you can make it back to the mainland, we'll give you a free pass.
Right, yeah, exactly. He instituted what he called a mark system, or a system of points. Prisoners would earn a number of marks, and when they earned the requisite number of marks required, they could be released. They could get an early release. I mean, these are supermax prisoners that everybody just kind of threw them away and treated them as badly as you can imagine. And Alexander Maconochie says, no, let's give them the opportunity to improve their conditions of confinement, to actually get out, instead of just throwing them away as worthless trash. So, I mean, you can imagine, this is pretty radical thinking for the time. So there were 4 stages of his mark system. First, they had the penal stage. So when you first came to the island, you were put in solitary confinement. You were required to keep your quarters clean, to obey orders, and to read and study the Bible. And if you did these things, and you did them well, you could earn enough marks or points to be moved to what was called the associated stage, where you would be put in group living. You would be with other people then. You can't imagine solitary confinement, right? It's pretty awful. It makes people go bonkers. So that's a pretty harsh punishment for anybody. So now at least they're in a dormitory-style barracks or something where they're around other people. If they continued to behave themselves, they didn't fight, they kept their quarters clean, they obeyed orders, they did everything that they were supposed to do, they would earn some more marks, and they could then move to the social stage where they would be allowed out on group work details. So they're actually out of the facility now. They're on group work details where they're just being supervised by 1 or 2 officers and a whole group of convicts, right? Well, okay, first off, it's not like they're going to escape. But if you think about it, this is the opportunity for the inmates to really show their true colors. How are they going to work? How hard are they going to work? Are they going to try to give their keepers any trouble? And so if they worked well, they did what they were supposed to do, they didn't give anybody any trouble, well, they could really rack up the marks now. And if they got enough marks, they would get a ticket of leave. That is, they would get a conditional pardon and a release to a community on the island. It's actually a fairly large island. And there were communities that were starting to set up around, and they could be released into the community where they could make a home for themselves. Now, it was conditional. So keepers would come around periodically and check up on the person to make sure that they were doing what they were supposed to be doing and fitting in, integrating into the community, being a successful member of society. And once they did that, they could actually earn passage back to the mainland. Great idea, right? I mean, who isn't going to be motivated by improving their conditions of confinement? When you treat somebody like an animal, guess what? They act like an animal. When you treat them like a human being with dignity and respect and say, hey, you know, we believe that you can be a better person, so we're going to give you the opportunity. Well, you know, I mean, why wouldn't somebody do that? And that's kind of how we look at prison classification now. Right? Somebody committed a murder, they got life. You know, they're going to start out at a very high level of security because, you know, hey, they got everything to gain and nothing to lose. But if they can show us over the course of time by their behavior, right, improve their behavior, show us by good behavior that we can trust them in lower security levels, why wouldn't we? Right? And why wouldn't they? So he was on to something here. I wish I could say that it was popular, but it wasn't. Yeah. They actually fired him. Yeah, they fired him because what he was doing was so against the grain of what was considered normal for the time. Those are scum of the earth. They're the worst of the worst. They should be treated as such. So they fired old Alex, and he returns to England, but it didn't die. Nope. Sir Walter Crofton, a scholar in penology in Ireland, was watching this experiment. And he said, this is a freaking good idea. It shouldn't die. So he adopts it in Ireland, makes his own little tweaks and modifications, and gets the thing running. And here we are over in America. We've just done this really cool probation thing, right? And we're watching too. Hey, look what those Irish are doing over there. That's a really neat idea. And wouldn't that go really great with our probation? So we grabbed that sucker, stole it, and we invented probation. We swiped this, but that's okay. There's no reason to reinvent the wheel, right? Because it worked. So we tweaked it to make it American, and it's been running ever since 1876. Pretty cool, right? Let's talk about probation and parole officers, the people who actually do the work. Requires a 4-year degree in human services. So how many people in here are thinking about probation and parole? No, there were a few of you, weren't there? Nobody in this class? Maybe it was my other class. Okay, well, you need a 4-year degree in human services. So it can be anything like this. Criminal justice, corrections, criminology, psychology, social work, guidance and counseling, child development, sociology, blah, blah, blah.
Now, my dad is a PO,
Okay,
but he has a business degree.
really?
Yes.
Huh, when did he get in?
He got in, I want to say I had to be,
He was an officer first though, wasn't he?
he went into corrections. Well, he did Wolverine a few years back. Did
Okay.
fine. Then he did corrections out in Jackson.
Okay, yeah, that's it then, because he was a CO first.
Okay.
And that's almost a surefire way to get in as a probation and parole officer, be a CO first. And if you think about it, it makes sense, because you get a lot of experience working with criminals before you work with them in the office setting. The duties require work under stressful conditions. Parole officers may work in a prison as part of a reentry program. So don't go into this saying, well, I don't want to work in a prison, so I'm going to be a parole officer. Well, you might wind up getting posted in a prison anyway. And parolees, let's talk about this. Parolees have actually, they're people that have been to prison. Okay? They might be dangerous. So don't go into probation or parole for the wrong reasons. You know, well, I don't want to work with those dangerous people. Well, who is it you think you're going to be working with? And not only have they been to prison and changed by their experience there, now you're going to be monitoring them out in the community. You're going to be going to their homes, to their workplaces. And a lot of them, you know, they don't live in the best neighborhoods. And there you are, diddy-bopping on off to go knocking at their door to check up on them and see if they're doing something wrong. You think they want to go back to prison?
Some do, some don't.
You think they got a lot to lose?
You might be the only thing between them and prison.
Exactly right. So, yeah, I mean, this is dangerous work. So don't think for a second that if you go into probation or parole, it's not going to be dangerous. To my way of thinking, I think it's a little bit more dangerous.
Yeah.
Because if you're working in a prison, right, you know this from your mom, you got a man down alarm on you. So if anybody's trying to hurt you, attack you, threaten you, you push the button, you pull the pin, and bingo, you got help in like 15 seconds. And a lot of it. But if you're out in the hood supervising somebody, you're going to be all by yourself, and you may or may not be armed. You probably don't want to be.
Sometimes they'll either call the police and tell them to meet them.
Yeah, a lot of times POs will call the police because, yeah, a lot of times you don't want to be armed because unless you're a police officer and you train regularly with a firearm, that's something that can easily be taken away from you by an experienced offender and used against you.
We help them with like Nighthawk and stuff.
Yeah, yeah, for absconder recovery. So one of the reasons parole officers are not armed is because they don't put in the time and the training, and then you just got something that can be taken away from you and used against you. So it's probably better not to have one. But don't think that this isn't dangerous stuff. Don't go into it for that reason, because that's the wrong reason.